I'm Richard Hayes. I'm Deputy Chief Economist at the ONS, and it's a delight to be speaking with Professor Diane Coyle after her very successful keynote speech at the ESCoE Conference this year. And so welcome, Diane.
It was a great pleasure to be here talking to you, Richard.
And I was going to start by asking you about the growth and development of the ESCoE as an institution and as a body, because I think this year was your keynote. We've reached the point where ESCoE researchers are bringing their research as the keynote presentation to our conference, which for me felt to be a really big step forward and a statement about where the ESCoE is and has reached. And I was wondering on your views.
Well, I've been in from the start. I was in on the original ESCoE right at the beginning, and it's been fantastic to see the community growing. Partly the number and quality of the submissions that we've had at the conferences year by year, that's clearly improving. Also, just seeing so many young people here, so growing a community and a pipeline of scholars who are thinking about these measurement questions, which might sound a bit dull, statistics, is it a bit dull? But actually it's about really deep conceptual issues about how we understand the economy and therefore measure it.
No, I completely agree, and I think you were clearly going straight into that territory today with your lecture, particularly looking at the ICT sector and what we can learn about it for productivity growth. And so I was going to start with a question about the sort of generic nature of ICT. The deep dive into ICT that you talked about this morning obviously gives us a lot of insight, but obviously this is a generic technology that impacts across the whole breadth of the economy. And whether there are any lessons for that sort of generic productivity puzzle that we can learn or take from the ICT lessons that you talked through this morning.
Well, there is a sort of version of the puzzle, which is we see these technologies having advanced so rapidly and dramatically since, before the 1990s, but certainly since then, and certainly since 2007 with mobile internet. And yet that's exactly when the measured productivity slowdown seemed to start. So what is going on the one hand, within 5 days, 1 million people were using ChatGPT, which looks like it's going to make much easier and quicker all kinds of things that people have to do in their jobs, as well as affecting leisure. And on the other hand, if you dig into where does the slowdown seem to have come from, actually the ICT sector seems to have been a big contributor. So that's really puzzling, and in a way I think it's because, exactly as you say, it's a very broadly used technology. It spreads through the whole economy. So if you think about a historical parallel, how much did printing affect productivity, or how much did the steam engine affect productivity? There will be influences that are way beyond the realm of economics, but also if you try to pin down those numbers, as economic historians have, it's just quite hard to get big numbers, and yet they transformed everything.
Is there a question of timing in here? I mean, it struck me a lot of your numbers that you presented were about a slowdown post 2015 in the rate of growth. And of course, when we're thinking about productivity, which is a growth rate, if the growths of the components slow down, then you're going to expect to see less impact coming through. So it could still be that ICT is a really big driver. It's just less of a driver than it was in the 1990s and early 2000s, where the pace of change was really, really quick. Is there an element that we just kind of missed some of this when it was actually happening, and we're having to come back and capture it now in our data?
I certainly think it's important to distinguish between the sort of levels, the changes that have happened, and what's happening to growth rates. And the figures that I was talking about today about the cost of computing, which is an engineering-based measure that we've developed, show that maybe there was some slowdown around the time of the general slowdown, mid-2000s, but actually in computing itself, it's mostly been post-2015. And even then, it's not a very big slowdown. These prices are still falling incredibly rapidly. Computing is essentially free, and people are therefore using much more of it. So what that says to me is that, in a way, it's how it's used that we should be looking at, and not the technology itself. And there seem to be some binding constraints in terms of how do businesses and organisations adopt these digital technologies to thereby deliver improvements in productivity across the board.
And I think that sort of drives a thought into my head about how these technologies transition from the leading firms in a sector through to smaller firms, or those who aren't on that competitive edge. And particularly about the transferability of your data scientist or your lead programmer, these sorts of people who are clustered together in certain firms because they're the ones with the digital infrastructure to actually make having a data scientist worthwhile. A data scientist on his own dropped into a normal firm is probably going to have far less impact than one who can leverage all of that technology. Which strikes me as driving us into a position where actually you have firms who are effectively operating on different productivity possibility frontiers.
Well, there's a lot of other fantastic ESCoE research going on around that, looking at firm level data, and as you say, the leading ones are pulling ever further ahead of the pack, and that seems to be because they've developed the digital capabilities, the people with the skills, the organisational structures that you need to take advantage of that. And also the increasing importance of intangibles and how difficult it can be for that to transfer across businesses. And so we think that the spillovers from how companies do things from one to another is an important part of spreading productivity across the economy. Maybe that's just harder with the kinds of technologies that we're talking about now, where you've got to use the data in very specific and granular ways that don't translate so well.
And it raises the possibility that we're in a position where actually our measurement systems may mask some of this, because a small number of very capital intensive, low labour firms and a long tail of high labour, low capital firms, if you're looking at labour productivity, these guys are going to dominate the picture and they're going to really mute the movements you see at that frontier.
Well, I'm quite interested in thinking about do we have the right kinds of classifications or categories for thinking about this? Because the production processes have been changed by ICTs. One consequence is the global production chains, the global production networks, as the literature calls them. And in those, you've got some firms with really specific skills that slot into a much bigger production network. And then you've got the sort of core firms in those networks that are generally quite large. They've got very advanced capabilities. They're putting together a whole bundle of things to give a solution or a package of a bundle of products to their customers. And that just doesn't quite fit into the concept of we've got a sector that does this and we're thinking about all the firms in the same way.
And I think that takes us to a question that you and I grappled a lot when we were thinking about telecommunications, which is trying to define some of the products in a world where just the technologies are moving so quickly is incredibly hard. So thinking about telecommunications and the work we did on looking at bytes of data being transmitted, nobody really buys a byte of data. What they buy is the content, the app or the video or the blog which is carried on the byte. And therefore that price that you attach to the byte is so heavily dependent on whether it's a highly sophisticated economics blog, as you write, or a cat video, as we've discussed many times. And whether we have managed to keep pace with that shift in the dual nature of some of these products is something that I spend a lot of time reflecting on when I look at our price data in terms of, is a telecommunications deflator even a meaningful concept in that economy?
Well, I think probably not, but we're not quite sure what the meaningful concept to replace it would be. You don't want to count all bytes of data as being the same, as you say. Equally, we've got some view about what the telecoms companies can charge for different services, be it SMS versus WhatsApp. But that's not where the value difference lies. The value difference is in what people are able to do with those different services.
And it may be a difference between who is creating and who is extracting the value.
So yes, I don't have an answer to that question.
No, I think we all struggle with this one, because it strikes me that telecoms is not the only area where this is an issue, and indeed, as we think more and more about AI, trying to distinguish, trying to think about the nightmare of trying to devise a price deflator for AI at the moment, strikes me as just being riven with exactly this problem. It's not the AI which is valuable, it's whatever process you're plugging the AI into.
And to make your life even more complicated, what it's doing is creating a really useful free input for lots of companies that they will start switching to using, possibly extremely quickly, given how quickly we've seen these particular types of AI models spread.
Which takes us back to fundamental questions of making sure that our definitions of intangible capital are correct. Because if we fail to capitalise these, the capital intermediate consumption combination is going to shift very dramatically. If we take cloud computing or AI as being just a routine service, we're suddenly going to see quite a big structural break in data, which I imagine is going to affect analysis by researchers such as yourself quite noticeably.
Well, this is one of the issues that came up in the cloud computing paper that we did for ESCoE, which was looking at prices, but also pointed out that because that's treated as an intermediate, as you say, yes, it's not capitalised, therefore it reduces apparent output and productivity, even though for the companies doing it, it's clearly a benefit. It's, they can at worst do the same thing they were doing much cheaper than they used to do it.
And I think it takes us to a need to have probably a more sophisticated approach to capital services. Cloud computing, I think, is a classic instance where a firm may be consuming a capital service but having no capital of its own. The capital is in the cloud server business, but all the services actually are falling elsewhere. Because equally, if you think about those cloud computing companies, they're owning a lot of capital and apparently getting a lot of capital services and not using them.
Which doesn't seem logical at all.
In one of the areas that we continue to work on quite closely is in the space of intangibles, thinking about data and data as an asset. And we've seen a number of presentations this week from people's efforts to attempt to place values on this or to understand this as a concept. How important do you think data is within the modern economy?
It's become very important, and it's another of those differentiators between the leading firms and the rest of the pack. I think internationally there's enough evidence now that the highly productive firms are creating a lot of proprietary data and using it to change their processes as well as improve their products. So it's become very important. You can look at things like the difference in market capitalization between data using companies and those in the same sector that don't use it so much. It's a tricky one to try to value because there are very few actual data markets with posted prices. And it's also got proprietary value that's linked to market power. So big tech companies use their holdings of data to keep out the competition. So part of the value of their data is true value, and part of it is monopoly rental market power rent. So there's no consensus about how to value data, except that we know it's become very important. And I think there should be a lot of work done now to try different methods and see how they compare with each other. I know, and you'll know more than I do about this, that the national accounts revisions will look at a sum of costs approach. You might argue that that's quite conservative because anybody spending the money would hope to get more use value out of it than the costs they're putting into it, although there'll be some uncertainty about that. But then the use value is very heterogeneous, so how do we think about that? How long do you have to wait to start to measure that use value? How can you allocate profitability to the use of data versus other things. So it's quite complicated. So it's another of those areas where the change in technology is clearly important and having a big effect. We don't really have a consensus about how to handle that.
No, and the danger is we end up with a conservative assessment of it, which underemphasises how important this is in shaping the economy and the analysis that we do. For me, there's a component in here of a cost of production method should include some component of a margin to allow you to get to that feel for the extra value that's being created. Otherwise, again, this ends up being a drag on productivity. The inputs in equals the value of the output out, which we know is a very traditional problem that we have in and around other services, which particularly in the government sector.
It's more complicated with these because of their non-rival nature, the very intangible nature of them. We've got a framework that thinks about a constant returns to scale world, and where there's much more homogeneity in products than there is actually, where we assume that markets are competitive often to figure out how we want to do the statistics. That's not the world we're in. The digital world has winner-take-all features, very high, very large increasing returns to scale, market power rents. So untangling all of that is going to be quite complicated. I'm talking as if I want to keep myself in ESCoE business for years to come.
Well, as long as the ESCoE is thinking about it in some way, I don't have to, which is perfectly good by me. Thank you very much. That's been an excellent conversation.
Thank you.